There used to be a time where you could do your spiritual practice in isolation. You could actually live in isolation. You could be off the grid in the real sense, and if you did real spiritual practice, you could find an ashram, and this was before the internet, before cell phones, before... and things didn't get to you. The outside world could be cut off and you could focus on your practice. This is no longer the case. Everything is interpenetrating much more than we're aware of, and this I don't quite understand why. And I remember about 9 months ago I was walking on the ocean near where I live, and suddenly the beings of light from the inner world, they said to me, it wasn't supposed to be like this. And they said, this was supposed to be the time when we were all working together. When the inner and the outer worlds were working together. This was supposed to be an explosion of consciousness in which the beings from the inner world and the human beings here were working together, and the light and the knowledge flowed, and somehow we have cut ourselves off from even the understanding of the inner worlds. And yet, everybody who does real spiritual practice knows you go into the inner worlds. In the inner man dwells truth. And so you have to understand what is happening in the inner world. If you're doing your spiritual practice in the outer world and the Mongols come, which they did at one time, Rumi and his family fled. You don't just sit around, or if you do sit around, you sit around in a very focused, practical way. I just think it's very important to be realistic in on spiritual practice and to adapt to the time that is present. There's a lovely story from Rumi's teacher, Shams, and this was the time of the Mongols, and one of his disciples came to him saying, the Mongols are coming, the Mongols are coming. And he turned to his disciple and he said, I've been teaching you to be a duck and now swim. And he was wise enough, Shams, that he taught his disciples how to be in that time of complete devastation. And I think because I have been shown certain things, I think I'm only being responsible to pass on a certain understanding, nothing drastic, a certain focus, a certain orientation that is needed in this time. It may be in 10 years' time, the wind comes and blows it all away. It may last 20 years. We don't know, but we can't live in isolation, and our spiritual practice cannot be done in isolation. And this, I have a slight bone to pick with a lot of the contemporary spiritual teachings that focuses on the now, because they don't seem to be aware that the now includes yesterday and tomorrow and things beyond time. And I do think we need to grow up spiritually and recognize the situation in the outer world and the inner world and in the in-between worlds. So, yes, hopefully hexagram 36 will change. And one is, spiritually one is always attuned to change, but at the same time one needs to be realistic in the moment. One of the great dangers of the business world is what is called the consumer society, which I've actually studied inwardly, archetypally, in quite depth, and I think it's much, much more insidious than most people realize. I think that the consumer society that advertises you to buy things you can't possibly need takes both your money, your time, and also a certain energy from your soul, I also think there's a certain dark magic in there, a certain entrancement. I actually gave a little video from one of the talks I gave here called Changing the Story and the Need for Magic. I think there is so little understanding about how we have become entranced by this incredibly self-destructive on every level story of capitalism and consumerism that we have been sold. And again, there are two things here that's important, and I talk about it particularly in the chapter on simplicity here. If one is going to really live spiritual life, it requires an attention and an energy. It's not a weekend undertaking. You can't just go to church on Sundays. And you need a certain inner and outer space to do it. And so you do need to declutter your life. Because what we don't realize is all of the tentacles of consumer society get our attention, they take our life energy, and they also take a certain soul energy because they promise happiness that they're never going to deliver. And so, just like, to take this one step further, we have been sold this story of continual economic growth that is ecologically unsustainable, but nobody dares to really, in the business world, to really put that together, because it's the foundation of the business world is you have to grow economically. So basically our whole culture is founded upon a house of cards or a pack of lies, depending on how you look at it. I don't believe personally as a mystic going out and shouting about it, because everybody else is shouting about so many other things and they're much better at shouting than I am. But I do believe that one can take individual responsibility for one's life, change the way one lives, and more importantly, change the values upon which one bases one's everyday interactions. So there is more space for loving kindness, for intimacy, for care, for those basic human values. How long this particular mirage that we call the business world will last, I don't know. Personally, I was very surprised after 2008 that it rebuilt itself. The pack of cards went up again so quickly. But the illusions that human beings hold on to, or the ability of human beings to hold on to illusions, seems quite remarkable. So I have adjusted my own way of life to become much, much more conscious of just getting what I need and trying to be aware of this tentacle of consumerism. I don't live in a hermitage or an ashram. I live in everyday life. Just to be aware of it. And that's, I feel, what I can do at the moment. Maybe that there are people who are trying to change that whole model, but I don't think we've got there yet. What matters is how we live in the present circumstance, and that's why I go back to keeping alive the sacred, keeping that connection alive, acts of loving kindness, being part of a community where the community supports each other. I find that very meaningful. This is the paradox of mysticism. You are taken into unbelievable spaces. I mean, from the first moment I looked in my teacher's eyes and I saw the truth that the land of truth in which she lived. And I said, I want that. I don't care whatever it costs. You are given experiences that most people don't even dream exists. You are given love. You experience love that isn't even in the storybooks, right? And at the same time, you're taken into that vastness. At the same time, you have to be really grounded and in a very simple, honest way. And that's kind of been the two poles of my experience. And care for others. Loving kindness. I think the Buddhist practice of loving kindness is incredibly precious. Or Christianity, it's love thy neighbor as thyself. In Sufism, we just practice love, and we have a certain adab, which is a certain way of being with others that includes that. And that's what matters. That's what is a contribution. Small things with great love. I like that from Mother Teresa. It's not what you do, but the love you put in the doing. Then you give it to God. Yes, I think, look, some people are called to be activists, whether social activists, environmental activists, even, I guess, spiritual activists. And what is really, really important is that it comes from a secure ethical foundation. Because the moment you lose that ethical foundation, a certain vibration of truth gets distorted. And I don't think the ends justify the means. Because when you see things from a spiritual perspective, there's a certain note. I call it a note of love or a note of truth. Somewhere they're the same. And my sense is that there is a network, and it's completely organic, and it's non-governmental, and it's there is an organic network of people, of groups, of communities that are some connected visibly, others connected invisibly, that is working to do two things: to hold a certain light in the world that is needed for transformation, that is needed for truth, and also helping certain foundational steps be made towards the next step in evolution. Whether you call it resistance or working for the future, or I think it depends where you are called to. From my own history, I always say I was a traditional mystic. I began meditating when I was 17. I wanted to go as deep within as I could to experience the root of the root of the root of the root, the truth of the truth of the truth of the truth. I was driven by this, looking back now, completely crazy desire, right? And then, well, the year 2000, something changed. And the first expression of that really was the conference I organized in Washington, D.C., which was called Spiritual Responsibility at a Time of Global Crisis. And I really feel passionately that those of us who have access to a certain spiritual light have a certain responsibility. How we live that responsibility depends upon our character, depends upon our calling, whether it can just be bringing a certain awareness of the sacred into our gardening, or it can be, going and setting up a social housing network. It doesn't matter, because I believe life is an organism that is trying to recreate itself. And I do think we've hit a bump in the road. And it may take an extra 30, 40, 50 years to go beyond this bump. But the earth is very old, and there is enormous wisdom in the earth. And it's a very, very big evolutionary shift to do with a certain global consciousness. And look, one thing you learn if you've done a lifetime of spiritual practice is there are a lot of setbacks. My God, you really think when you're 17, you think you can sit and meditate 8 hours a day and get there, in 3 or 4 years, hey, right? And 20 years later, you see, 30 years later, you realize there are a lot of setbacks. And this is a setback, but it doesn't change the plan. You have to adapt to the present time, but there is an underlying shift towards global evolution. How that is going to play out in our lifetime, I don't know. I'm looking now towards the lifetime of my grandchildren, because I sense there, I see a hope in my granddaughter's eyes that maybe she's seen something I haven't. But we are each called in our own way, and we just stay true to that. And there's no big drama, because the people who make the big dramas, they're not going to be around forever. And it is this network of souls linked together that are here to help the world to evolve. And they're still here. And as I say, the evolution of the world, it has been planned. The Naqshbandis are known as designers because they have access to certain designs. And it won't be as we think, that one thing, that is for sure. Once you put things in the hands of God, it's usually completely different to how we imagine it. But I do feel it's important that we work together. And that's why I've been so moved recently to see environmentalism and spirituality come together. That's why I was so moved by Pope Francis's encyclical. Because when I began this work, spirituality and environmentalism were like two poles. The environmentalists didn't want anything to do with those, airy-fairy spiritual people, and the spiritual people just wanted to transform themselves and weren't really interested in the environment. And then when people like Thich Nhat Hanh came along and said, these are bells of mindfulness, we have to wake up, this engaged Buddhism and the work we are trying to do in the field of spiritual ecology, which is to bring those fields together. It's still very, very foundational, it's very pioneer work, but I think there are seeds for the future. Well, for the Sufis, servanthood is really one of the highest states. It's said after the station of oneness comes a station of servanthood. And it's really it's a grace to be able, or to be allowed to be of service. And the simple reason for that is that with true service there shouldn't be any ego. Because the moment there's an ego, again, you keep it within your aura, your frame of reference. Look, I think in little ways we can all be of service, but it's what they call selfless service. And I think it's very good to ground one's practice in a certain service, however you see it or call it. At the same time, to acknowledge, say, within my tradition, there is a whole, it is one of the final stations, I think probably just before the station of no station, there is a station of servanthood. And there is a title of Sufis, we are called his servants, and his favorite title of himself, God's favorite title of himself, is the servant of his servants. So there is a whole deep spiritual understanding of service and servanthood. And it's difficult to explain or understand because we live in a culture of doing, and we think service must be about what can I do. But just as I gave you this, shared with you this vision I had of these lights over America, and there are many, many different ways of service, and it is a practice that gets deeper and deeper and deeper as more of you is drawn into being of service and what that means. It is in the end, it is really an offering of one's heart and one's life to God. And those who are fortunate enough or unfortunate enough, God takes up your offer. But it is... I like this saying of Mother Teresa when she was asked, how can you take care of so many? And she said, I only take care of the one. Because for her, everything was just an expression of the divine. And if you can live from that place, then of course your life will be of service. But there is a deep honor to being of service. It is really and it is a commitment. But like most things that have an esoteric dimension, there is a mystery to it, and that is difficult to describe. So at the beginning, look, there's nothing wrong with finding a place where you can be of service, and if your ego is involved, okay, your ego is involved. That's why I said, just make sure it is ethical, and then it is grounded in something true. Later on, if one really walks the path, you give yourself more and more and more to God. And then you can be used. Think of over the centuries, how many people have had how many different concepts. The Sufis say, in the name of he or she who has no name, but who appears by whatever name you call it. Look, you can call it Jesus, you can call it Allah, you can call it Odin, you can call it my beloved. I like my beloved because that's how that is for me, my beloved. And because for Sufis, he's our beloved, but it's an experience of love, it's a path of love. We are drawn to love. And it's interesting because on this path we do a lot of meditation, which is just going somewhere. The mind stops, if you practice properly, and you get lost. And there is nobody to pray, and there is no prayer. But prayer for me, begins with that there is an other. I call it my beloved. And I want to talk to my beloved. I want to be with my beloved. I want to feel my beloved. I need that companionship that so often in the night when I am awake, rather than meditating, I pray. I just go into my heart and I just call out to God. What matters is your feeling. What matters is the feeling with which you cry. And the Sufis have so many stories, but there's somebody once asked, why doesn't God answer my prayers? And there is one answer, it's because he's listening to you. But there's another answer which I always like, which is a story Rumi tells about the beautiful young man who goes to the baker. And he goes into the baker and he asks for some halva. And he's such a beautiful young man. The baker looks at him and he looks at all the people standing in line behind him and he said, just wait over there, I've got some just getting in the oven ready. And he serves the other customers. And then the young man says, but where's my halva? And just wait, there's such sweet halva waiting, ready soon. And so it goes on. And the baker just liked to have the beautiful young man in his bakery. If God can't be bothered with you, he answers your prayers. Those he loves, he keeps waiting and waiting. Yeah. If there's you and the experience, you're not yet there. If you're having an experience, there's still two. a real spiritual experience, there's no you there anymore. So if you're having an experience, the ego is involved. You know the difference, by the way, between the, I don't know why I bring it up, the ham sandwich and the egg sandwich? Oh, this is my teacher, Mrs. Tweedy. She heard this from General Schwarzkopf. She really liked him. And he was talking about soldiers, but she applied it to God. The difference between the ham sandwich and the egg sandwich is in the egg sandwich, the chicken is involved. In the ham sandwich, the pig is committed. So you aspire to being the ham sandwich. And usually if you have something to gain from the experience, it's the ego. If it takes you out of yourself into a deeper perception, that's more likely to belong to the soul. The danger is at the beginning they go together. That you get an experience and the ego tries to claim it. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you recognize that's what's happening. And don't let the ego become too puffed up. And the worst thing, of course, is a spiritualized ego. The moment you think, oh, I'm a very spiritual person, that's a road to disaster, because one thing my teacher said, it's much more difficult to get rid of a spiritualized ego than an ordinary ego. So it's, don't go down that road. If you have a teacher, the teacher can usually rub your face in it. Or there was a time when my teacher, Arina Tweedy, was in India with her teacher, and she began to become clairvoyant, and she could see people's auras and their thoughts, and she was thinking, oh, I am progressing. And he looked at her one day and he said, you are not even a human being. Until you become less than the dust at the feet of the teacher, you haven't even begun. And then she realized it was all just fantasy. So you do have to be careful. And with experience, you can recognize it, but sadly, many people take an initial spiritual experience and make something out of it that isn't. They don't realize it, they're just beginning. And then you have to be very, very careful. So, that's why there are spiritual traditions. It's why I am a bit careful about people who kind of make mix different bits of spiritual traditions together to make their own, because usually they forget the sandpaper. And a good spiritual tradition, brings in humility and brings in a certain sandpaper that stops you from over-identifying with the spiritual experience. You can't help it at times, but you do have to be very careful and just be attentive. And the real thing leaves you behind. It is. You get lost. There's nobody there and you come back from them so bewildered and so out of yourself. You can't make anything out of them. You just feel humbled by them. You just bow down in awe before the greatness of God or the sweetness of God or whatever it is you have been given the grace to experience. And of course, the real person who experiences something is not you, it is your soul. Your soul is the real experiencer of the wonder of God. But that's a whole esoteric mystery that hasn't really been understood in the West. We tend to bring everything into the sphere of the ego. There's a beautiful poem I quote in one of my books, Ibn al-Arabi, of Sophia talking to the soul. And you get that real spiritual dialogue, which is between the soul and something higher. And that is... There comes a time when you realize that the ego is just occasionally gets a glimpse of the real experience. But the real experience is so... The ego can't. Look, the ego is designed, is born to live in this world, to have its feet on the ground, to go shopping, to have hopeless relationships, or whatever it is, that careers, and I don't know what egos do nowadays. It isn't designed to be with God. You have to die before you die, to be taken into that arena, that place in the heart. So, but at the beginning you have to be careful, yeah. And just watch out. If you think, oh, I'm doing well, you're probably not. My concern is that people invest a lot in what turns out to be a distorted image of the truth without realizing it. It was like in the 80s when gurus became popular in America. I don't know if you remember that time. And a lot of people, well, I guess not a lot, quite a lot of people invested a lot in gurus who let them down. You know, for example, they renounced the world, they gave up all their possessions to join the ashram, you know, only to find the guru had a Rolls Royce around the corner. And they got very, very... Something in the soul got very sad as a result, because they'd done what they thought was true and right. Yes, they had a lesson to learn, but also they'd been conned. They'd invested spiritually in something that was a distortion. And later there became kind of a few guidebooks to check, you know, go through a checklist before you give away all your possessions to follow a guy with a long beard. And what I'm saying now is it's a bit similar, but on a much more collective level, that things are very distorted and you've got to be very careful. And I think you know, if you are sincere in your spiritual practice and you keep it simple, and you watch your step, then I think it's fine. But there are more opportunities for wasting your spiritual energy and intention than there were 20 years ago. That's all. And it makes me, look, I've invested my life in this business. You know, I was 17 when I first had my first mystical experience. I'm, you know, almost 50 years later. I was sent to America 25 years ago, and I've seen a lot. And I know how precious that longing in a human being is. It is the most precious thing there is. It's worth diamonds, more than diamonds. And you need to nurture it, you need to care for it. It's like a child, you need to look after it. You need to find it the right nourishment. And you need discrimination. So mostly you need common sense. There was a lovely theosophist, Joe Miller, from San Francisco. He had the Sufi walk in Golden Gate Park back in the 70s, I guess. And he said for spiritual life, you need four things. Common sense, and a sense of humor. Then somebody asked him, what's the fourth thing? He said, even more common sense. But then he was the one who, he met my teacher, Irina Tweedy, and he gave this wonderful talk about burn, baby, burn. Because she wrote this book, The Path of Love. It's like a bridge of hair across the chasm of fire. And he said, I wish I could repeat his accent, but I won't even try. And he said, you walk across this path of love, this bridge of hair, and into the chasm of fire, and then the fire burns the bridge, and you fall into the chasm of fire, and it's burn, baby, burn. So those are the two sides of the journey. One is common sense, sense of humor. The other is burn, baby, burn. So if you combine all of that, there is the darkness of one's personal psyche, which is the shadow work in which you uncover wonderful truths about yourself or difficult truths about yourself. And that's very valuable. Then there is my favorite, of course, is what is called the darkness of the deus absconditus, the darkness that is before and after creation, the darkness of pure non-being, which is incredible, which is tremendous, which is much richer than love. And there is, of course, the dark night of the soul, which I think is what, in a way, separates those on a spiritual path to those on a mystical path. The dark night of the soul is that period you experience when you have to give up every spiritual concept, every spiritual idea, everything that you thought belonged to God except possibly love. And it torments you, makes you desolate, and takes you to the further shore of love. There is at the moment, it's as if the earth is going through a cloud of toxic gas, which we can interpret as darkness. And I think a lot of the time we use the images we have here to interpret what is beyond our understanding. And this particular darkness I've spoken about, it has in the little book, Darkening of the Light, I do write a chapter about the story of darkness, because I do think this darkness that we're going through has a story to tell, has a meaning to share with us. Yes, it's very difficult for spiritual practice, it's very toxic. There are elemental forces present in it that I would rather not encounter in a dark alleyway. But does it have a meaning? Yes, I think it does. So, in a way, light is easy, because light upon light rises towards light, and light comes down upon light, and it's light upon light. There is the light of our human aspiration, the light of our souls, and the light of God, the light of the divine, and they come to meet, and when they meet, a certain spiritual life is born, the life of the Spirit. And you learn to work with light. You learn to weave light into your life. You learn to, just like you can weave love into your life. You weave the threads of life, of love into your life. You weave a certain texture of light into your life. The darkness is more difficult. Possibly because as a culture we don't, we've had this, good and evil, which is true but not true. So one of the sadnesses I have at the moment is we don't seem to have much understanding of what is actually taking place, of how this present darkness dehumanizes us. I think one has to be conscious of darkness. I'm sure there are great masters who know how to work with this darkness. For me, the heart chakra and the spiritual heart are synonymous. On this particular path, we work just with the heart chakra. Within the heart chakra, there is a miniature version of all the other chakras. The heart chakra is known as the king, and if you work just with the heart chakra, then it activates all the other chakras in the right order and the right way. What is, in my understanding, essential is the heart chakra is the home of our divine consciousness. In the Katha Upanishad, they talk about that person no bigger than a thumb, maker of past and future, lives in the heart. And say in the heart chakra, it's centered like in the middle here. There is actually an atmic heart or a cosmic heart on the right-hand side. But say within the heart chakra there is, or the spiritual heart, that is the center of divine consciousness, of the consciousness of the higher self. And once that, on the Sufi path, the way it works is there's this initial experience of tauba, which is called the turning of the heart, which is when the heart chakra is spun. And it's spun at a certain frequency, and once it starts to spin, it starts to activate the spiritual body, which for most people is dormant. They're not even aware they have a spiritual body until they die, and then they experience it after they go through this tunnel. The spinning of the heart chakra activates the spiritual body that then, through the practice and also through the transmission, because on the Sufi path we work with transmission, begins to wake up and begins to evolve. And that's really when the spiritual evolution of the human being begins. There is a misunderstanding in the West that somehow identifies with a certain transformation of ego consciousness as being the spiritual path. It's actually the preliminary before the spiritual path, because the spiritual path real spiritual life has to do with the evolution of the spiritual body, because that's what you take with you. And what I've found, because on this particular path we work with souls, and that the human being begins their spiritual journey where they left off last time. The Sufis have really mapped out the spiritual heart in more detail probably than any other spiritual path. They have this understanding of the 5 chambers of the heart that go deeper and deeper and deeper. I wrote a chapter of that in my book, Fragments of the Love Story, that is really central to Sufi teaching, that there's the heart of hearts in the middle, and there's a whole detailed understanding of the different chambers of the heart through which you can experience different levels of reality, what they call traveling in the inner worlds, or traveling within the heart. And it's really this activation of the spiritual body that enables you to have a spiritual life, which is a life of the spirit. And that becomes present in your daily life and in your practice, and also actually quite separate from your daily life and quite separate from your practice. This is, again, what's not generally understood, is that the spiritual body evolves at a much higher frequency than our ordinary consciousness. And I think it's said in the Bible, it's a spirit that quickens. And although it becomes part of our spiritual life, part of our practice, it is also separate and sometimes independent. Sometimes it draws you into its consciousness, and sometimes it continues without you necessarily being aware of how its evolution is progressing. I mean, I do think that those who have access to light need to live that light fully to contribute at this time of crisis, this time of darkening. I think it's an immense task, and I don't necessarily think it would change anything, but it could stop something worse from happening. Certain things have already been written, and so they are going to get played out. That is how it is. But there could be worse consequences. And it is like, for example, there is a very important spiritual practice of pure awareness. The Sufis call it Shahid. I think it's similar to the original practice, Buddhist practice of mindfulness, sati, which if you are aware, really aware, then certain negative things cannot happen. Just like certain negative energies can't have access to you if you are aware. It's a much deeper form than is presently understood as mindfulness, which is more an active, engaged practice, while awareness or sati or shahid in Sufism, to witness, is it's not passive, but it's not an active, it's just an awareness. And if you have that awareness, then that is a light that comes out of you that stops certain negativity from taking place. And I do think those who have access to a certain light, who can live a certain light, are needed at this time. It's strange because spirituality in the West has become caught in individualism. And it is like, it's interesting, I studied Zen. In the purer Zen practice, like in the original Soto Zen, the whole monastery practiced together. It was never one monk's practice. That didn't make sense. It was everybody's practice. And somehow the potency or the power of the light within the individual that belongs to the community, to the Sangha, to however you see it, has been limited by people thinking it's just about their evolution, their enlightenment, their awareness, their practice. And it's really the practice of life itself. Life itself, human life itself, has a spiritual practice. Yes, it's evolved at times. Some parts of the world it's more shamanistic, in some parts of the world it's more about pure consciousness. A lot of it got lost in the West due to perversions of the power practices of Christianity, and is only now beginning to come back. But it's never just our practice. And I do feel quite passionately that those who have access to that light need to live it for the sake of the whole.